Welcome to Module 1, Introduction to Managing Conflicts of Interest in National Pharmaceutical Systems. This section covers 4 components, including the need for prevention and management of conflict of interest, understanding conflict of interest distinctions, and pervasiveness of conflict of interest. Conflicts of interest are a concern, because they may improperly influence the independent judgment or actions, and undermine the loyalty of an individual, who is obligated to serve a party or perform a role. Let's look at these examples. Here's a case from the health insurance sector. A comparison of Thailand's 2 tax-financed health insurance schemes found that the health expenditure of one was 4 times that of the other. The difference was partly ascribed to governance arrangements in the advisory committees, where the scheme with higher costs lacked provisions for managing conflicts of interest, while the scheme with lower costs did have provisions. Here's a case from a regulatory advisory committee. A study of voting activity of advisory committee members of the US FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research revealed that members who had ties to or a financial interest in a pharmaceutical manufacturer were more likely to vote in ways that favored the manufacturer than those with no ties or financial links. Conflicts of interest, particularly those arising from financial or contractual relationships between committee members and private sector entities, affect decision-making and have an impact on public health. Adverse outcomes can occur throughout the pharmaceutical system and include poor quality of care and harm to individual, including higher mortality and morbidity, due to a lack of access to safe, effective, and quality-assured medicines, or the inappropriate use of medicines. Inappropriate use can also accelerate the development of antimicrobial resistance. Wastage of valuable health system resources, due to the underuse of generics, inflated prices, poor quality and inappropriate or ineffective use of medicines. Undermining public trust in government institutions and the decisions that they make. The lack of trust may result in a disregard for recommendations, such as those in standard treatment guidelines. Here are some examples of conflicts of interest in different areas of the pharmaceutical system. 1. Marketing authorization or product registration. A regulatory official in charge of a marketing authorization decision, who receives remuneration for a speaking engagement from the company submitting the marketing authorization request. 2. Selection and reimbursement. A chair of a selection committee in charge of a decision concerning the listing of a medicine for reimbursement, was involved in research funded by the company developing the product under consideration. 3. Inspection of manufacturing facilities. An inspector is charged with inspecting a manufacturing facility, and has a relative that works for the same manufacturing company. 4. Prescribing, dispensing and use. A committee responsible for updating a national treatment guideline receives sponsorship for the updating process from a pharmaceutical company that has a commercial interest in the outcomes of the decisions made. So, what is conflict of interest? A conflict of interest is a situation and a risk that arises when a person has a financial obligation or other interest that could potentially interfere with their entrusted obligation, duty, or responsibility, and could thus compromise the person's judgment or action could be compromised. It does not mean that the judgment or action will be compromised. Having a conflict of interest is not the same as corrupt or improper conduct, unless laws or policies are deliberately violated. For example, if laws require disclosure of conflicts of interest, and those interests are purposefully not disclosed. Here are 3 selected definitions of conflict of interest relevant to public pharmaceutical committees, used in law and public policy, public service, and medical research, education, and practice. Legal definition. Conflicts of interest are situations where an individual has an obligation to serve a party or perform a role and the individual has either 1. Incentives or 2. Conflicting loyalties, which encourage the individual to act in ways that breach his or her obligations. Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development definition. A conflict of interest involves a conflict between the public duty and private interests of a public official, in which the public official has private capacity interests, which could improperly influence the performance of their official duties and responsibilities. Institution of medicine definition. A conflict of interest is a set of circumstances that creates a risk that professional judgments or actions regarding a primary interest will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. In this e-learning course, the obligation, duty or responsibility is referred to as a primary interest, and the financial or other interest that conflicts as a secondary interest. Let's look at the examples we saw previously, to identify the primary and secondary interests in each case. Here you see the primary interest in the column on the left, which involves the duty or responsibility of the different government employees or committee members, such as the regulatory official in charge of a marketing authorization, a chair of a selection committee in charge of a decision concerning the listing of a medicine for reimbursement. An inspector is charged with inspecting a manufacturing facility. A committee responsible for updating a national treatment guideline. On the right, we see the secondary interests, which include receives remuneration for a speaking engagement from the company submitting the marketing authorization request. Involvement in research funded by the company developing the product under consideration. Has a relative that works for the same manufacturing company. Receives sponsorship for the updating process from a pharmaceutical company that has a commercial interest in the outcomes of the decisions made. These secondary interests create a risk that decision-making may be affected. Conflicts of interest can be difficult to recognize and assess. And not all conflicts of interest have the same magnitude of risk with regards to the probability and extent to which the conflict of interest could unduly influence decision-making. It is therefore essential to ensure that the primary interests of an official or a committee member, and the secondary interests that could constitute a conflict of interest, are clearly defined and understood. Let's look at an example. A direct conflict of interest results if the head of a procurement committee owns stock in a pharmaceutical company, and there is a potential for financial gain if medicines from that company are purchased. The magnitude of the risk and the extent of the impact on tender decisions is likely much higher than an indirect conflict of interest, where the head of procurement has a cousin who works in a pharmacy, and may see little financial benefit. Several factors contribute to the pervasiveness of conflicts of interest in public pharmaceutical decision-making. 1. Pharmaceutical systems are complex, and public officials who convene or serve on committees may have frequent interactions and form relationships with private sector and other actors. For example, an analysis of an immunization advisory group in Canada found that only 4.7% of members were independent of industry. Similar hurdles may occur in countries with a limited pool of experts in some fields, such as oncology. 2. Processes, such as product registration, that may involve discretionary decision-making, can be particularly susceptible to conflicts of interest if there is insufficient transparency, and where checks and balances are lacking. 3. Responses to emergencies and public health crises, such as COVID-19, can require governments to make quick decisions such as on vaccination strategies and regulatory approval, and implement rapid responses that bypass usual processes and controls. Thank you for your attention to Module 1. Introduction to Managing Conflicts of Interest in National Pharmaceutical Systems.